30,000 soldiers, marching in fog, fully convinced they were winning. By the time the sun burned through that mist, most of them were already dead. What happened at Lake Trasimene in 217 BC was something else entirely. It was an execution, planned down to the last footstep. And Rome, the most feared military machine of the ancient world, walked right into it without a single moment of hesitation. They weren't weak. They weren't poorly trained. They were arguably the best soldiers on earth at that point in history. And that confidence? That unshakable belief in their own power? That's exactly what Hannibal used to destroy them. Rome in 217 BC was not a nation that knew what fear felt like. Not deep existential fear anyway. For generations they had built a war machine so reliable, so disciplined, and that defeat was never really defeat. It was just a temporary setback. You lose a battle, you raise more legions, you lose a general, you elect another one. The Roman system wasn't just built to win, it was built to absorb punishment and keep going. That psychological armor was almost as important as the iron they wore on their bodies. But 1 year before Trasimene, something happened that cracked that armor for the first time. A Carthaginian general, a man named Hannibal Barca, did something no one thought was even possible. He crossed the Alps, the actual Alps, with elephants, with tens of thousands of soldiers. He dragged an entire army over one of the most punishing mountain crossings in the ancient world and brought the war directly to Italy. Think about what that meant. Rome had always fought its wars out there, in foreign lands, on distant shores. Now the enemy was on their doorstep, and not just at the doorstep, it is already inside, already burning farms, already humiliating Roman forces. At a river called the Trebia, a Roman army met Hannibal and was shattered. Not defeated, shattered. Thousands dead, the rest fleeing in panic. For the first time in living memory, Romans were running from a fight, not toward one. Now, how do you think Rome responded to that? With caution, with patience, with careful planning? No. Rome responded the way Rome always responded, by doubling down. The Senate pushed hard for speed. Forge fires burned through the night. Fresh soldiers were trained on a rushed schedule. The message was simple. Find Hannibal, fix him in place, and destroy him. Restore the Republic's honor. And fast. Into this moment steps a man named Gaius Flaminius. Flaminius was the newly elected consul, one of Rome's 2 chief magistrates. And he was not, to put it gently, a patient man. When reports came in that Hannibal's army was moving through central Italy, torching villages and farms as it went, Flaminius saw not a trap, but an opportunity. He believed Hannibal was running. He believed the Carthaginians were trying to avoid a decisive engagement, and he believed that if he moved fast enough, he could catch them, pin them down on open ground, and end this. So he gave the order: march fast, march hard, give the enemy no time to breathe. Before the sun was even up, the Roman camp was alive. Armor buckled onto shoulders, standards hoisted into the gray morning air. 30,000 men, heavy infantry, cavalry, supply wagons, all moving in a long, disciplined column. From above, it would have looked like a river of iron flowing across the Italian countryside. Every step confident. Every soldier certain they were the hunters. What none of them knew was that they were already being watched. Hannibal knew they were coming long before they arrived. That's the thing people often miss about Hannibal. Yes, he was a brilliant battlefield tactician, but before any swords were drawn, he was already 3 steps ahead in his thinking. He didn't look for the strongest ground, he looked for the right ground. Ground that would turn Rome's greatest strengths into fatal weaknesses. And north of Lake Trasimene, he found exactly what he was looking for. Picture it. A narrow corridor of land, barely wide enough for a road, squeezed between a deep lake on one side and steep, heavily wooded hills on the other. Even if you wanted to design a killing ground from scratch, you couldn't have done better than this place. The lake sealed off escape to the left, the hills blocked retreat to the right, and the corridor was long enough that by the time the Roman vanguard reached the far end, the soldiers at the rear would still be filing in at the entrance, completely out of sight, completely unable to help. Hannibal stood on those heights and calculated. He measured distances with his eyes. He timed how long it would take for the entire column to enter. He figured out exactly where to place each unit so the attack would hit everywhere at once. Then his army moved into position. At night, in silence, no campfires, no shouting, weapons strapped down tight to stop any metal from ringing in the darkness. Light infantry hidden low on the slopes, ready to launch javelins from above. Heavier infantry positioned higher to press down once the chaos started. Gallic warriors placed at choke points where they could burst through the flanks like a battering ram. And the cavalry split into two wings, one at the far end of the corridor to seal the front, and one circling wide behind the Roman column to seal the rear. By the time morning came, the hills were full of armed men, and the corridor below was empty and quiet and waiting. Then came the fog. In the hours before dawn, moisture rising off the lake began to fill that narrow strip of land. Slowly at first, thin wisps drifting along the road, then heavier, then thick enough to cut visibility down to almost nothing. Sound itself seemed to get swallowed. Voices muffled, footsteps deadened. Even the world shrunk to just a few meters in every direction. For Hannibal, lying still on that hillside, watching the mist roll in, this was almost too perfect. The Roman cavalry entered first, their horses picking carefully through the wet ground. Riders leaned forward, squinting through gray air, seeing nothing but road and the dark shimmer of the lake beside them. Behind them came the infantry. Thousands of men in long files, shields on shoulders, spears resting easy, still in marching formation. Not locked, not braced, not ready. They didn't think they needed to be. They were chasing the enemy, remember? The column stretched deeper and deeper into the corridor. The front had no idea where the rear was. The rear had no idea what was ahead of them. And above, absolutely silent, tens of thousands of Carthaginian soldiers lay flat against the hillside, barely breathing, watching the iron column below them like wolves watching a herd move into a valley. Then Hannibal gave the signal. The war horns sounded, one note, long, brutal. It came down from the hills like a blade through the fog, and then the sky opened up. Javelins rained from above. Not one or two, a storm of them. They drove into the extended column before a single Roman soldier could raise a shield. Men in the vanguard went down. Men in the middle went down. Those who stumbled over the fallen were stabbed before they could recover. And even as the javelins were still falling, the Carthaginian infantry was already charging down the slopes, fast, using the hillside to accelerate, crashing into a formation that hadn't even begun to close ranks. The sound of it must have been overwhelming. Steel against steel, screaming men, panicking horses, stones tumbling down from above and smashing through shields, and over all of it, the fog, thick, disorienting, making it impossible to see where the attack was coming from, impossible to tell friend from enemy, impossible to even know which direction safety was. The Romans weren't cowards. That has to be said clearly. What happened next shows exactly how much fight they had left in them even in an impossible situation. Some units managed to close formation in the middle of the chaos. Shields locked together, spears leveled outward, small Roman squares held their ground and thrust back. Soldiers stabbing through gaps, holding their lines, refusing to break. The individual acts of pure, desperate courage played out all along that corridor. But courage alone couldn't fix the geometry of the situation. Every time a gap opened in the Roman line, Carthaginian troops poured through it. Every time a unit tried to pivot and face a new attack, another hit them from the flank. There was no room to maneuver, no high ground to fall back to. No way to send word to the front or the rear because no one could see or hear that far through the fog and noise. Flaminius rode hard toward the center of the fighting, screaming orders, trying to rally his men into a coherent defensive line along the lake's edge. For a while, it seemed like the sheer force of Roman stubbornness might buy them something. But the pressure from the hillsides didn't let up. A wave after wave of Carthaginian troops pressed downward. Not in a frenzied charge, but slowly, methodically, like a hand closing into a fist. The Romans had nowhere left to go. Some were forced backward into the lake itself, dragged under by the weight of their armor, drowning within sight of dry ground. Then Flaminius died. No one is entirely sure of the moment, just that at some point he was surrounded, cut off from his bodyguards, and fell among the bodies of his soldiers. When word spread through the fighting that the consul was gone, the last thread holding the Roman force together snapped. What followed wasn't really fighting anymore. It was finishing. Small groups of Romans formed tight circles, backs together, jabbing outward at anything that moved. One by one, those circles were overwhelmed. A rear element of about 6,000 men managed to break out and scramble up to higher ground. They survived for now, but stood looking back into fog and smoke with no real understanding of what had just happened below them. Inside the corridor by late morning, the sounds of battle were fading. Not because it was over quickly. The killing had taken hours. But eventually there was nothing left to fight. Bodies were piled on bodies. Shields shattered. Standards face down in the mud. Survivors bound and led away in silence. In the space of a single morning, more than 15,000 Roman soldiers were dead. The rest were prisoners. An entire consular army had ceased to exist, not defeated, not scattered, erased. When the news reached Rome, the city went silent. Not the silence of mourning, the silence of disbelief. And this wasn't supposed to be possible. Rome had taken losses before. But a whole army? On Italian soil? Ambushed in a corridor like animals driven into a pen? The consul himself dead? The Senate convened an emergency session. There were no rousing speeches, no finger-pointing, no denial. They understood with cold clarity what they were dealing with. Hannibal wasn't fighting the way other enemies fought. He wasn't meeting them on open ground and testing his strength against theirs. He was designing the battle before it began. Choosing terrain that neutralized Roman discipline, picking timing that neutralized Roman courage, finding the one weakness in an otherwise formidable machine, the assumption that confidence was enough. Fear rippled out to Rome's allied cities. If Rome couldn't protect an army of 30,000, who was safe? And some began to waver. Some started calculating whether loyalty to Rome was still the wise bet. But here's what makes this story more than just a tale of catastrophe. Rome didn't collapse. It trembled, yes. It grieved, yes. And then, slowly, painfully, it adapted. After Trasimene, Rome moved away from the impulsive aggression that had been Flaminius's fatal flaw. They appointed a dictator, a man named Fabius, who began a strategy of harassment, delay, and patience. Shadow Hannibal, wear him down, deny him the decisive victory he needed. Don't give him another Trasimene. It took years. It took more suffering, including a disaster even worse than Trasimene. But eventually, Rome did what it had always done when pushed to the edge. It survived, it learned, it came back. That's the real lesson here, and it cuts deeper than military history. The most dangerous enemy you will ever face isn't the one who's stronger than you. It's the one who has already decided the terms of the engagement before you even realize a fight is happening. Hannibal didn't beat Rome with superior numbers or better weapons. He beat them by making Rome's confidence into a blindfold. He let them believe they were in control while he arranged every single variable around them. That is what makes Lake Trasimene one of the most perfectly constructed defeats in all of military history, and why people are still studying it 2,000 years later. If this story hit you the way ancient history is supposed to, not as a dry recitation of dates and names, but as something that feels alive, and something that tells you something true about how power and pride and strategy actually work, then you know what to do. Leave a comment below with which moment of this battle you found hardest to believe actually happened. Share this with someone who thinks history is boring, and stay with us because there are more stories exactly like this one waiting, and every single one of them is worth your time.